Hi, Lindenwood class. We're going to pick up with Echo Mountain on chapter 16. The river was where we'd left it, endlessly traveling down its own winding path, through shadow and sunlight, under fallen trees furred with moss, and over boulders polished by the current. Someone, somewhere, had named this the Androscoggin, but we generally called it the river. At the end of the path and across some marshy ground, a flat rock above a deep pool at the edge of the current made a perfect place to drop a line. "Find me some bait," I said to Samuel, who would have been happy to hunt crickets in September when they were thick on the ground, but was less eager to forage for April slugs. "I don't like things that are slimy," he said, making a face. "Help or go home," I said. So he sighed a huge sigh and crawled into the undergrowth to hunt for a slug, which he found and brought back to me on a leaf veined with its glimmer trail. "Go get me another," I said. I wasn't fond of slugs for bait either. They really were slimy, and they tended to leak their guts when I put them on a hook, leaving not much more than skin and slime behind. But I hadn't brought a spade to dig for worms, and I didn't like to use salamanders with their big glossy eyes and their little hands. So I said, "Sorry, sorry, sorry," and gritting my teeth until my jaw ached, threaded the slug onto the hook as quick as I could and dropped it in the pool, my end of the line wrapped around a good strong stick, and waited. Some fish were as unimpressed with slugs as I was, but a trout will take a slug, and soon one did. I yanked the line up and away, hooking the fish by the mouth, sorry as I did it, sorry as I wound the line around the stick and pulled the trout up to the rock, sorry as I beat it senseless with a rock, sorry as I put a fresh slug on my hook, sorry as I sent it down into the pool. I shivered with their pain, cringed as they died, but none of that stopped me from doing what I had to do. "Let me try," Samuel said, reaching for the line. He was only newly big enough for this, and I myself was newly sad that my father would not be the one to teach him. But I gave Samuel the line and taught him how to hold it in two hands, how to move it slowly so the slug seemed to swim through though it was dead, how to wait, and then yank hard to set the hook. No good hesitating if you meant to do a thing like that. Do it and be done with it, good and quick. That's what I told him as the fish took the bait. That's what I told him when the fish thrashed and fought so hard to be free that I had to hold on to Samuel and the line both, regardless of how determined he was to do it on his own. That's what I told him when we hauled the trout up onto the rock, its gorgeous scales flashing in the sun, its eye wild before I beat it to death. That part I spared Samuel. That part, I'd never done that part before my father went to sleep. But I had done it ever since then, never without being sorry. Samuel yammered about how much nicer his fish was than mine, and I hoped that meant he'd eat some of it. Muscle came from meat, and Samuel was so little. I wanted him bigger, stronger, tougher. Some fresh fish would do him good. So I agreed that his fish was by far the better, and I hunted up another slug so he could try for a third. And I stood close, but without touching the line as he cast it in again, and caught another trout, and did everything else that needed to be done, except that last part with the rock. I made him watch while I cleaned the fish and threw the guts into the river to wash downstream like big, gory worms, a feast for turtles and bottom fish and flies, but unlikely to attract bears to the place where we fished. "Those are the best fish anyone ever caught," Samuel said of his two trout, "and yours is pretty nice too." The three fish were identical. "You're right, and they will be delicious," at which he smiled. I wrapped the fish in oilcloth and tucked them into my pack, setting aside the glass jar I'd brought with me. "What's that?" Samuel asked. The balsam inside had melted a bit with the heat of the sun on the rock, turning the tears and dew a nice shade of copper. "Nothing." I climbed down to the edge of the river to let a little cold water flow into the jar, just enough for some wildness. "It's something like tea, nothing you'd like." And then I made a mud pie and wrapped it in my kerchief for the bee sting that was sure to come. Chapter 17. When we reached it, the hive was wide awake, which is not a great thing when a person wants honey. But I was there, and the hive was there, and I would try. "Sit," I said to Samuel, pointing at a log just off the path, "and don't move." He gave me a look. But he sat where I pointed and watched as I buttoned my shirt to the neck. Aren't you afraid of getting stung? He asked. Not afraid so much, though I hope I don't. From my pocket I took my knife and a flint spearhead I'd found when my father and I were planting potatoes. Keep that with you, my father had said. It could save your life some day. I'd thought he meant as a weapon, until he showed me how to strike the flint on his shovel to make sparks. Fire, he had said. Few things more valuable in this world, and you can make all you'll ever need if you know how. That's the secret to everything, knowing how. And you'll teach me, which was as much statement as question. I will, but you'll learn best by doing. I had thought about that. How am I supposed to do something that will teach me how to do it if I don't know how to do it in the first place? That's like a circle. My father had laughed. It is, but it's true, though you can read about how to do things too. What about learning things from people who don't know how to write, like some of the others on Echo Mountain, like babies, like dogs? And what if someone doesn't know how to read? That takes lessons. Everything takes lessons, my father said, though some you'll give to yourself. And my father had been right. Sometimes I was my own best teacher. He taught me how to make tinder and how to strike the flint with my knife and how to coax a flame, but in the end, I had to do that work myself before I truly learned how. How come we don't use matches anymore? I had asked him. I remember him sighing. Same reason we built our own cabin and grow our own food now. Matches cost money, Ellie, and the nearest mercantile is a world away. So I had practiced with the flint until I had blisters, but it had still taken me a very long time before I could start a fire. The day I first made one without any help was a very fine day indeed. Look here, I said to Samuel, as he sat on the log and I cleared some ground near his feet. From my pack I took what looked like a bird's nest, a ball of oak bark I'd shredded onto coarse wood thread and molded into shape. I carried one with me always, usually several in the bottom of my pack. This is your tinder, I told him, setting the little nest aside, which you can make yourself from threads of dead bark or dry grass as long as it's very fine. Then I gathered small twigs and built a tiny pyramid just big enough to hold some dried leaves with room left over for the nest of bark thread. Then I scraped the flint hard and strong with my knife until sparks flew into the tinder and then caught, suddenly, making a small flame that I blew on gently, gently, until it strengthened. I quickly slid the burning tinder among the twigs, which caught, making a stronger flame. Before long, the fire was burning well enough to add more sticks, and finally a big one I could use as a torch. Samuel watched it all in silence, with round eyes, and I felt at least 10 feet tall. Who taught you to do that? He said, his face serious. Daddy did. I blew on the flames and fed them with dry leaves to make sure the torch was well and truly engulfed. Why didn't he teach me? Samuel looked so small that I nearly scooped him up into my arms. He will. Soon. I did not say, or I will. Our father would do it. He would. The biggest stick was flaming well when I lifted it into the air and swept it mildly enough to feed it, coax it hotter and hotter. Then I held it aloft as I scooped dirt and stomped on the fire I'd built. What'd you do that for? Samuel said. That was a good fire. And I got what I needed. Now, stay right here and don't move. The hive was so close to the trail that I thought maybe I should send Samuel farther away, but I didn't know any words that would make him leave. So again I said, don't move, before I turned up my collar and pulled on my gloves and crept through the thicket around the oak hive. As I came closer to it, I held the torch straight up until it began to go out, then blew the last of the flame away so it just gave smoke. With the smoking branch in front of me, I edged up to the oak tree, the hive in its big dark mouth humming away, and then gently poked the stick into the hole, not too far, just enough to fill the hive with smoke, which would make the bees drowsy and dumb. After a bit, a few stumbled out, stunned, and flew lazily to the ground. Others, coming in from their work, spun crazily, looking for a foe, but I stood as still as a broken clock and waited until the hive grew quiet. Then I pulled the stick away and plunged it, hot end first, into the ground, and slowly reached my gloved hand into the hive, feeling for the comb. The bees in the hive covered my glove until it trembled with their sleepy buzzing. I could feel the comb where they stored the honey that fed them all winter, that kept them alive in the year's hardest, leanest months, that was meant for them and their young. And I felt their terror. felt their panic as they choked and nodded in the smoke, their queen weeping, and I let go of the comb and slowly drew my empty hand from the hive. It was covered with bees, slowly regaining their wits, baffled by the smoke, but waking as I watched. I shook my hand gently as I backed away from the hive, and some of them fell softly away. Others clung without moving, and I knew they had stung my glove and died doing it, which made my heart hurt. "Go, go," I said to Samuel as I cleared the thicket. "Quickly now," and off he went, up the path ahead of me. Oddly, it was only then, as I was leaving, that a lone bee flew up and stung me on the cheek. One of the hardest lessons I had ever learned concerned honeybees and how they died when they stung. How they couldn't leave just the stinger behind, so they had to leave some of themselves behind too, and died, as the ones on my glove had, as the one who had stung my cheek had, which made no sense to me. I hadn't taken a drop of honey. I was well away, and now a bee had died, regardless. My cheek was on fire, no less when I pulled the soft, fuzzy bit of bee off my skin, but somewhat better when I pulled open the kerchief full of mud and pressed it against my face. I told the bees I was sorry as I flicked their sad remains off my glove and dragged it through the dirt until it was clean. Samuel came back down the path toward me. "What's wrong?" he said. "Why didn't you come with me? And why do you have mud on your face?" "Bee sting," I said, wincing with the pain of it. He came close, peering at my cheek. "You've got a big bump there." I nodded. "It'll go away." "Why aren't you crying?" I shrugged. "Won't help me to cry," though there were times when tears did me some good. He looked thoughtful, reached out to wipe away some mud that was dripping down my jaw. "Where's the honey?" "I didn't take any." "What? Why not? You got stung for nothing?" I headed up the path. The bees didn't have enough to spare. Not yet. But Samuel wasn't impressed. "You could have got a little for our porridge," he said bitterly. Porridge without something sweet was unfortunate. I didn't tell him that the honey had not been meant for porridge. Instead, I told him what my father had told me. The bees need it more than we do, especially in the winter and the spring, for their babies and their queen and themselves. I thought again of the egg I'd fed to Maisie instead of using it to gather stink. "Let's trade one of the fish to Mrs. Anderson for some eggs," I said. Samuel said, "As long as it's your fish." But as it turned out, a snake came first. Chapter 18. When we reached the yard, we found my mother and Esther taking turns at the butter churn. "I caught fish for supper," Samuel cried, rushing toward them, while I lugged our catch the last of the way up from the river, tired now, wiping traces of mud from my cheek. "We didn't know where you'd gone," Esther barked, but not at Samuel, at me. "We were worried, Ellie. You should tell us if you take him with you." I might have said any number of things to that. Always at the end of every list was the one answer I couldn't give her. You were the one who was supposed to be watching Samuel the day Daddy got hurt. "And why did you go fishing when we have venison?" she said. "I'll dry the fish so it'll keep," I said, "or we can use it to make broth for Daddy." But she just shook her head. "You know Samuel can't swim. You shouldn't have taken him with you, and you should have told us." "He followed me. I didn't mean to take him along." "And Mother didn't mean to trade Maisie's puppies to Mr. Anderson for one of his milk cows." "Esther," my mother snapped, "that's enough." But she was wrong. It was not enough. "You gave the puppies away?" I said in a voice that was far too small for the big thing that rose in my throat. "Promised them, yes, as soon as they're old enough," my mother said. "We need that cow. She's much younger than Jupiter and Venus. We can't expect them to give milk forever." "But all the puppies?" "Mr. Anderson is a hunter," she said, churning so hard now that she was in danger of busting the dasher into kindling. "He's the main reason we have meat on our plates. He needs new dogs, coming of age behind his old ones." "But all of them? You gave him Quiet?" She didn't look at me. "We have barely enough food to spare for Maisie. We don't need another dog. Another cow we need." "But you wouldn't even have Quiet if it weren't for Ellie," Samuel said, close by my side. "She saved him." "And she'll drink the milk we get from this new cow, and the cream, eat the butter, the cheese." My mother still wouldn't look at me, and I had no desire to look at her, or at Esther, who wasn't smiling exactly, but who didn't look the least bit sorry. "You can visit Quiet any time you like," my mother said. But that was cold comfort. I had seen what became of a dog that lived in a pack, a dog that hunted for a living. "This isn't because one more dog will eat too much. Mr. Anderson would have left us one puppy if you'd asked. This is to punish me." My voice was even harder than hers. "You can't make me give him up." "We all give up things we love," my mother said, "whether we want to or not." I thought of the things she'd lost when we'd left our town life. I thought about my father slowly thinning away, the sight of his hideous sores, and I thought about Quiet as he had struggled in that water, waking. I went into the woodshed. Maisie gave me a curious look. She was on her feet, licking one of her pups. She didn't object when I crawled into the nest and put my head among those little dogs, and cried, and knew it was Quiet who licked the salt from my cheeks, soothing the last of the bee sting, while this new hurt took up a place in my chest alongside the flame that burned hotter, now that I had even more work to do. And we'll end there. We'll pick up again in a few days.